let me sort of open up the discussion with some of my thoughts in reaction. First of all, to the Mudang's presentation, because I think that she brings up a point which I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is the division between lay practitioners and clergy in a tradition like that, where the role of the clergy has become, in a way, very specialized toward, and I mean, perhaps always was, let's say, quite specialized toward the performance of particular rituals, performing particular services. And then, on the other hand, you have lay practitioners who, there, on the one hand, as she pointed out, there may be a gap between them and the accessibility of those services based upon price and other kinds of difficulties, which she dealt with very authoritatively and very pragmatically in her presentation. But what I also liked was that she acknowledged the role that recognizing the ability of laypersons to worship the gods on their own. I think that this is really important because, first of all, of course, I mean, it takes some of the burden off of the system of seeking assistance in one's spiritual life purely from highly specialized, highly trained professional spirit workers in the form of rituals that are very costly and logistically difficult to mount. It takes some of the pressure off of that system. But also, and this is what I particularly have been thinking about lately, is the existence of a body of lay practitioners and of worship of the gods by lay persons on their own also creates a broader basis for the religion, which is very important, I think, in the context of thinking about a religion's future and its survival. Because what we see in a lot of countries is that the indigenous polytheistic tradition has been pushed to the margins and exists purely in the form of a kind of service-based spirit worker capacity that people will resort to, including very many people who, however, don't identify with the religion that spirit worker comes from, and in fact don't even think of it as a religion that they would identify with. And so you have this situation, which I think imperils these traditions, where a lot of people may have recourse to the services of these spirit workers and therefore may be participating in that tradition in a certain way when they need to, when they really need something, because they recognize that it's a spiritual technology that they require sometimes. But because they don't identify with it as their religion, and because it's not, in a sense, structured that way, there's the problem of it therefore not having recognition from contemporary nation states or from multinational organizations, or from any of the various kinds of interfaith organizations, which have a multitude of their own problems as well. But I think that encouraging a base of laypersons directly worshiping the gods of that tradition. Although in some ways, some spirit workers may not want that exactly because they may see it as taking business away from them. But I think far more would find it, I think, useful to have that broader social basis that comes from having the capacity for people to engage with the gods as laypersons on their own without feeling like they either have to become a spirit worker themselves or have to consult one within a framework where it's going to be logistically extremely difficult and expensive, and it's going to be difficult to even make it happen. And so, instead they end up being discouraged and abandoning trying to engage with that tradition at all. And so this is something I was thinking about in connection with that. And I think that it also touches on things that were brought up in Aliakai's presentation as well. And it also goes back to Makatiwata's presentation, because there, I mean, we see another example of a tradition that has been forced into subsisting in this day and age, although it was once a more widespread religious tradition. It's been pushed into this narrower space of being a purely a shamanic practice, which is not to say that shamanism wasn't always the core of the tradition, but I think that its profile looks different when it's working off of a base of generalized worship versus in the contemporary world where it's all alone and marginalized and inherently, I think, endangered as a result of that. So with that, I've spoken a little. I've spoken at some length, and so anyone who would like to jump in and respond. First of all, Mudong, if there was anything that any thoughts that you had in response to these thoughts that I've expressed, you could perhaps weigh in. Are you there? Okay, she may have stepped away for the moment, and so all right. Yes, I'm going to. And Alikai is asking. I was addressing you in part, but I was primarily addressing the Mudang. All right. Well, I'll recognize Theanos Thrax with a question.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for fantastic presentations, all of you. This was thought-provoking and honestly heartwarming and soul-quenching on so many levels. So I just want to give thanks to that. In recognition of the time that we're at, I could ask questions of each of the presenters, but won't. I instead
we're going to go a little long, but obviously we're going to try to keep things brief.
One of the things that I found as a common thread throughout all of this is very salient, I think, for the topic of the conference at large, which of course is about polytheisms today and tomorrow. In that we have this idea, this focus on presumably each of us who has presented at this conference, hopefully each of those who is in attendance at the conference has hope for our polytheisms existing not just in the literal tomorrow, but in the ongoing tomorrows, which will be picked up by subsequent generations, some of whom are young today and learning from us, some of whom will learn from them and those who learn from them. And so there's this theme throughout each of the presentations today around diaspora. And so I want to acknowledge that as something that is really important, because especially with the onset of our technologies, with the interconnectedness that we all have now. I mean, how many of us are thousands of miles away from each other right now, or hours and hours displaced from each other in terms of the time zones? We are in a position now where topics of diaspora and how these are handled within new and continuous traditions become very important. And if we had the time for, I mean, we could have a whole conference specifically on diaspora. One of the things that comes up for me as a spirit worker who, I see clients from across 24, 30 different traditions. And when I'm seeing clients, I need to determine basically on intake, where are they coming from? Do they have a tradition? Do they have a practice? Do they have spirits, named ancestors or deities that might be showing up? And if so, how am I going to interact with them? Or is it better for me to get my Rolodex out and make a referral? Or am I all they've got? Is this an emergency situation where I'm the only one that they have right now? Is it a Band-Aid solution until they can get to the right person? And I think that when we're talking about these things so often in the internet discourse, which is of course what has brought, it's brought all of us together here. It has brought together the very foundations of this Center for Global Polytheism and Indigenous Studies. So the internet is not a bad thing, but at the same time, we have a lot of catching up and growing to do as traditions. And so rather than asking a specific question, I just want to use my moments here to really focus on that as a prompt, maybe for returning to later as a dialogue, or if anybody else wants to take it and run with it. But it's a thing that it comes up for me in questions quite a bit, because, as Dr. Butler so eloquently put it, a lot of the traditions that are surviving today in the 21st century, they express today in ways that the specialists and those with the most knowledge and the training who have been able to receive in traditions where initiation occurs, they've received that specialized training or the ability to do certain things. Attempting to condense this because I realize I'm rambling a little bit here, but there's an incentivization within the service-based nature of these things where it becomes a challenge in, I know, many practitioners' cases where if they are attempting to make their money, because we all need to eat, especially if we are impoverished, especially if we are disabled, we all need to eat, we all need to go to the doctor, we all need to go to the dentist. And so there's an incentivization dynamic which is muddied by the economic components of these things. And very often teachers wind up inadvertently rendering themselves quickly obsolete by training their own competition. And that is a thing that exists. I've seen it happen again and again and again across multiple traditions, which do have service-based positions of spiritual technicians and who utilize specific spiritual technologies. So how do we move forward towards this collaborative tomorrow that we're all of us investing so much of ourselves and our practices and our prayers and our work into, in a manner where we are recognizing the inherent issues of this rapidly globalizing set of often cross-traditional or intertraditional diasporas at the global level. And I'll leave it at that because it just sort of like balls in whoever's court. And again, thank you, everyone. This was brilliant. I wish that we had 4 more hours to all talk. This is fireside conversation stuff that I really do. This is one thing that I hate about the remote conference model, because I would love to just be sitting nearby and passing food and tea and mead around and having great conversations. So thank you, all of you, everyone who contributed tonight, and I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he really amplified my points and helped me to sort of uh, think about them in a more condensed and perhaps salient way. It it's the question of, you know, there are many potential ways to address this kind of a nexus of problems for surviving traditions. But I think that one aspect of it that I'm interested in and that I think doesn't get enough attention is the necessity for a certain reciprocity between these traditions as spiritual technologies and these traditions as nexus for belief and worship. And I think that one of the things that I'm seeing as a common issue is that if traditions are solely seen as spiritual technologies, and you don't have enough of a notion that they're also a place of belief and a place of worship, that's a particular danger. And it's a danger, like I said, in terms of people's having a lack of identification with the tradition, and so they don't defend the tradition when it's under attack, which all of these, any surviving indigenous polytheistic tradition is critically endangered today. I mean, they're all even if they're regionally dominant, like Hinduism, they're in the crosshairs of the largest, most powerful, most well-funded religions in the world. And in most countries, they're pushed badly to the margins. And to be regarded as a form of spiritual technology that you have recourse to when you absolutely have to, but maybe you don't even want it publicly known that you've done so. I mean, that's just not a sustainable position for traditions in these countries. And I think that, and I mean, in some ways, this is the same whether you're talking about the tradition in the mother country or in the diaspora. It's just qualitative. It's just quantitatively, so to speak, worse in the diaspora, because you also have people who are already part of a minority community in a country and already feel all kinds of intense pressures to conform. But you're talking about an equal amount of pressure, really, socially speaking, in Korea itself. I'm sure that I'm sure that the Mudang would agree, because to be just a spiritual technology, and I mean, I recognize as well that in Korea, I mean, there's a long history behind this, because the indigenous polytheism was already being pushed to the margins somewhat by Buddhism and by Confucianism. Those were already pressures, so that it was already beginning that kind of transition from being a tradition with its own temples, for example, to being increasingly something that was being given space in someone else's sacred space. It was being given ancillary space in Buddhist sacred space, for instance, and being pushed increasingly into this narrower role of being just a spiritual technology, just a body of techniques. And then that just coalesces with the economic pressures of the modern capitalist environment to create a very difficult position. Let me see. Let me just look at the chat to see if there were any Yeah, Ali Akai, did you want to come in and say something? I mean, also, I see that there was a question addressed to Makatiwata. But Ali Akai, why don't you speak a little bit, and then we'll pick up the question to Makatiwata.
Well, I kind of wanted to expand on your thoughts there a little bit because I noticed, much like Theanos, is that how you pronounce your name? I noticed that, much like the theme that Theanos talked about sort of the idea of going into the future and the balance between, getting yourself out of existence versus making things more accessible. I noticed that accessibility itself was also a major theme throughout these talks. And as much as that is a major theme of my own work, I do kind of want to stress that, much like you were talking about, the sort of empowerment that we can give to individual people as potential leaders within our individual polytheistic communities, because most of the folks here talking are, in some way, shape, or form, whether they kind of got pushed into that position or whether they ended up electing to put themselves there. I think that empowering folks with accessibility toward the individual sort of worship component, and empowering folks to be more mindful, as I talked about in my own talks, of these external pressures will, by its very nature, help to separate the spiritual technology and the specialist, or within Hellenism, that would be the Montes, the seer, from the individual worshiper. Because the Montes wasn't the one who went and, as I stressed in my talk, went and performed your funeral or your wedding. The Montes was the person you called when you made a whole bunch of offerings, you had no freaking clue what was going on, everything was failing, and you needed a specialist. You needed somebody who knew more than you. By empowering folks with what they can do themselves, we can then both ensure that our clientele, if we are going to be specialists, which I do some small amount of readings and things, like I've done them in the past, for the most part, again, I don't tend to do a lot of spirit work stuff. I tend to be more of an educator. But for those of us who are, ensuring that your clientele has done everything within their power, that they have, in their words, examined their own Kares before they then seek out their Montes, before they then seek out additional help. That accessibility and empowerment, and that movement towards more acceptance of our own polytheistic natures as practitioners and as worshipers ourselves, I think will do a lot toward moving forward in that way, despite the pressures of capitalism. I think that the fear of competition and ultimately stifles the ability for the individual to connect with the gods in the way that I talked about at the end, like at the end of my talk. I feel as though coming together as a community will create more demand and need for specialists, for the individuals, and your own work, much as the Montes in antiquity will still put you forward as who is useful and who is not. There are always going to be examples of charlatans out there. We're always going to have to deal with them. But I personally think that the separation between what is for the specialist and what is for the general populace, like the Mudang talked about in her talk, what is accessible to like Korean folk magic versus what is specifically accessible to those who are initiated. I think that latent Christianity is a lot of the source of people viewing things as a spiritual technology rather than a holistic way of life and worldview. And the more we work toward eliminating latent Christianity from ourselves, from our communities, the more that we work towards distinguishing our traditions and making it easier for the average person to connect with those beings, the more we're going to see that distinction, that fear of competition will go away. Because right now, even a basic level competency with, say, magic can get you clientele. But truly, what you would hope for in even an occult community, which again is not what I'm a part of, but I used to be, is you'd hope that if somebody is going to somebody else to pay them, it's because they either are, have no interest in the occult and desperately need that special expertise, or more preferably, that they are somebody who practiced and couldn't get results on their own and thereby needed the extra help. So my hope would be that it would be more efficient for us to help enable and empower each other, like talks like this, rather than continuing to create a cycle where only specialists have that knowledge.
Well, yeah, and then we also, if there's a clearly defined space for lay people, for example, to practice mugyo in the way which is appropriate for a lay person, then you also are going to have, you're not going to have so many of these nasty fights about the closed nature of traditions, because there's going to be a space to say there is an aspect of this tradition which is closed because there are clearly defined requirements to be a spirit worker within this tradition, to be a mudang. But there are other ways. There are ways in which you can, as a layperson, you can worship the gods. You can practice mugyo in the way that's appropriate for a layperson. And that also gets us out of the closed nature of that tradition, I think, in large part because you're not then threatening the intangible cultural resource, to use a term of art. You're not endangering the transmission of that tradition, which people have every right to be protective of and to demand that it not get completely watered down. Or, even if there are people who choose to take it in a looser direction, that there should always be the option of people who are maintaining it in a stricter way, so that all of these kinds of different options are necessary for a healthy religious ecosystem, I think, for any of these traditions. Let me just call on Sephanus for a quick question.
Right. Well, just to add to this discussion and your very excellent phrase of this ecosystem that we have, one of the, not only because of the pluralist kind of core value that I think is inherent in polytheistic systems, but also encounter what Aliakai was speaking of in terms of the latent Christianity. One of the things that hasn't been named yet, and I see this all the time, is that it's a specifically Protestant virus, I'm going to call it, which is this notion of self-containment, that a priesthood of all believers and all that basically means you don't need anyone else. You are not accountable to anyone else. And so at the World Parliament of Religions, a couple of weeks ago, in one of the pagan panels, I heard something which I have heard innumerable times by pagans in my life that I've encountered, but also as like the culminating message of some ritual or performance or whatever at Pantheacon, for example, which is you already have everything you need, right? Which then means that every single person is, I have all the deities within me, I am the one, I am the all, I am the center of the universe, and that is the biggest barrier, I think, mentally and spiritually and conceptually, to actually building functional pagan community in the United States and worldwide, is because, well, ultimately you don't need anyone else. And so why build the community? Why go to that trouble? Whereas I think with pluralism, the pluralistic ideal, at least as I understand it, the pluralistic virtue is, you are different than me. Therefore, I don't know what you're about. I need to get to know you. I need to ask questions of you, whether you are another human or some type of spirit or some type of deity. And also the ones that are opposed to you, you need to do the thing that you're doing, and that's fine. And so I try to embrace that as well amidst this critique. But this is the thing is, you know, the pluralism should, the pluralistic impulse should lead in a polytheistic context to profusion of further diversity and the realization that that diversity is good and inherently valuable, and thus getting things from this spirit worker and this spirit worker. You know, there, I mean, there is kind of the danger of, you know, more and more, but at the same time,
Well,
that kind of element is just so lost in American general culture.
well, yeah, I mean, because in a way, you want both. You want an environment where spirit workers can survive, practically speaking, that they have a degree of support, that they can keep going and they can pass on their tradition to the next generation, because that's just basic for survival. But I mean, you also have to acknowledge the ability of people to contact the gods on their own. If for no other reason than just practically speaking, because those of us who are living in Christian and post-Christian countries, you know, we're just unlikely to have access to professional spirit workers, and many of the people who may set themselves up in that fashion within many of our revivalist communities may not be, frankly, worth the patronage that people might give them. They may not be, frankly speaking, worthy of the recognition or the authority that we would confer on them, because we would be kidding ourselves to act like they don't have the kind of support structure coming from an integral tradition would give them, even if they're very well meaning. They can go astray simply because they don't have that support structure either. And so we have it must be admitted, a relatively chaotic environment. And I mean, that's okay. You just have to recognize that it's a relatively chaotic environment. And you know, ecosystems, especially when they've been disrupted, they can pass through a chaotic state. And a chaotic state is just a state of hypercomplexity. A chaotic state is a state where it's not clear right now exactly what all of the different trend lines are, and exactly what's their vanishing point, so to speak, the point at which they're going to come together and be resolved. We need to recognize this, and we need to have a dialogue that recognizes the necessity, at a minimum, I think, of a pole of belief, in addition to the existence of a spiritual technology pole. And in connection with that, a notion of religious identity, religious identification with the tradition that a spiritual technology comes from. Not to say that spirit workers can't do their work on behalf of people who don't identify with their tradition. Of course, they're not going to do that, because whatever tradition you look at, these people, they don't turn anybody away who's in need. At least, you know, generally speaking, they don't apply litmus tests. Maybe that's in part because they can't, frankly. Maybe 200 years ago, they would have. But they're not in a position to do so. And so I think minimally, we need to grow at least the notion of these traditions being religions, which means that people can identify with them as religions. They can say, for instance, my religion is Mugyo. To make that easier and a more accepted a choice, and I think also to have a discussion around what people can do on their own in terms of worshiping the gods, because it's got to go along with that. So at any rate, I'm taking up a lot of the time here. Makatiwata, do you? Unfortunately, I cut off your presentation kind of just at the point where you were really talking about exactly what, when I contacted you, I was like, make sure that the presentation isn't just about the history of the tradition, but is also about the future of it. Now, I mean, what do you see in terms of, because I mean, within your tradition, you also have it's also passed into this kind of structure where you basically have shamanic practitioners. Yeah, and then you have a vast mass of people who, for the most part, identify as Catholics, basically. Even though they may have a lot of recourse in a practical matter, they may have a lot of recourse to elements of the indigenous tradition, but very, very few people. What do you see in terms of people? Do you see any kind of a nascent movement toward people conceiving of there being more of a religion of the Anito?
Right. So, yes, you mentioned people who would personally identify as Catholic. I think the majority of Filipinos would tick the Catholic box if they were asked if they were Catholic, but would, in their own communities, in their own towns, would practice something that the Catholic Church would not consider as Catholic. But yeah, in relation to that, to your question about the future and what I'm seeing right now is, I do see a growing interest in pre-colonial culture, history, and religion among the youth, especially in the diaspora, I think, because, you know, how it sort of, because people are more aware of the history now. When I was growing up in the Philippines, just for the record, I'm in my mid-30s, growing up, and we were taught in school that polytheism, animism, these are things of the past, and these are things that are no longer present in Filipino culture, which is, of course, categorically wrong, because when you go to any provincial town, you'll see plenty of practices that if you were not familiar with Catholicism, you would think is the same as the indigenous polytheisms or animisms present in the Philippines. But for people in diaspora, Filipinos in diaspora, who weren't sort of indoctrinated into that sort of school system in the Philippines, and they read things from history books or from the internet about pre-colonial history and religion, they have this, and probably they don't have very strong Catholic communities in for example, the United States or in whichever countries they're from. They have more liberty to sort of explore that identity of, you know, possibly deconverting from Catholicism and entering or rediscovering the indigenous traditions. One of the people that I put in the references is Ligaya, who is a Filipino-American polytheist who started, of course, reading on Philippine history and rediscovered these indigenous traditions of her ethnic groups and began practicing this as well. I think what many of us who were born and raised in the Philippines take for granted is that we've got a lot of these things that Filipinos in diaspora have to read about, and these are readily available to us in our communities. So, for example, when I went to Palawan, which is another island in the Philippines, and they have a stronger sort of animistic, polytheistic strain in their folk religion, it was not uncommon for you to have children participate in the rituals performed by the Balyan or the shaman. So I went to this shaman's house, this Balyan's house, which she eventually became our friend and mentor. And there was no question whether the people in the town were Catholic or not. It was just everybody seemed to want to participate. And this girl at that time, probably maybe 12 or 13, we were talking to her and she said, when I grow up, I want to be a Balyan. I want to be a shaman, like the host of that ritual. And so I see hope there now that the Catholic Church does not have the same sort of influence in Filipino society as it used to. So I think there is a lot of hope. But the danger I see is among the traditionally animist, polytheist, or pagan groups in the Philippines, in the highland communities, there is an influx of missionary activity, many of them Protestant, seeking to convert these remaining communities into the form of Christianity, which I hope we can sort of reverse and try to protect, because a lot of these people, a lot of these communities convert because of economic reasons. There isn't a lot of opportunity for you if you're not part of this sort of culture. I think it's very similar in other parts of the world.
Oh yeah, I mean, and also the dynamic that you're talking about is also one that we see in a lot of places that were initially Christianized by the Catholic Church, and for a lot of reasons that didn't have to do with any inherent generosity on the part of the Catholic Church, but which had to do just with issues about often the colonial power structure and the way in which power was exercised in that environment, tended to develop this kind of folk Catholicism structure where you had this kind of, you had a nominal Catholicism, and then you had this kind of penumbra of traditions. And the more that they could define themselves strictly as spiritual technologies, the better that they could hold on the fringes there. But now what you have, and again, I mean, an ecosystem metaphor is appropriate. It's like what you have now is you have a much more invasive and aggressive Christianity from evangelical Protestants who are moving in, and they're seeking to break down the structures of folk Catholicism. And they're also deeply committed to, of course, evangelizing anybody who is not even nominally Christian. But on top of that, they don't necessarily regard Catholics as being particularly Christian either. They think that they need to be evangelized just as bad. And so, studies have been done in a lot of places, but particularly in South America, to show that people, when they're exposed to the evangelical missionary activity, they become less likely to consult these specialists. They become less likely to consult a shaman. They become they adopt a more condemnatory attitude toward these practices. And this is where I think the role both of diaspora communities becomes crucial, actually, because I think that people in diaspora communities, while they may be cut off from the kind of roots tradition which has been surviving through the vehicle of folk Catholicism, they're also out of that environment of intense proselytization, and they're away from the front lines of evangelization. And so they're in a position to be able to step back and provide a reflection back to the communities, the non-diaspora communities. They're able to provide a reflection back of a different perspective, on that indigenous tradition, and they're able to model a respect and evaluation of that tradition, which has never been possible to express in centuries, in many cases. And on the other hand, the role also of people like us coming together who are outside of those traditions altogether, but are speaking on behalf of allied traditions, similar traditions with a similar history and facing similar kinds of pressures, developing a discourse in the hegemonic language, the hegemonic international language of English, for instance, and in the hegemonic structures of academia and interfaith groups like the parliament, doing that whole thing, and wearing away at the structures of privilege in the West that help to empower these ongoing movements of cultural destruction elsewhere in the world. And so that's kind of my hope. Let me just see if there's anything going on in the chat I need to respond to. I see maybe we'll go another 5 minutes to 9:45, if that's okay with everybody. Ali Akai points out, stripping the authority of the church from Christianity create an even more extreme form of orthodoxy. Yeah. I mean, this is the way that power works a lot of times. Yeah, I mean, ironically, when the church was operating as part of an integrated colonial power structure in a lot of places, they could exercise a somewhat softer power. A lot of times it wasn't particularly soft, what with the burning people, the burning books, and the outlawing of traditions, of course. But nevertheless, in certain ways, they could afford to be a little bit more diffuse, let's say, in where the rubber meets the road. They could afford to be a little bit more diffuse, and that's how you get this edifice of folk Catholicism. And I think one of the things that bothers me is there's a tendency to sort of act as though this is just kind of innate virtue of the Catholic Church. And I mean, this it's not any generosity on their part, but it's really just a function of the more diffuse exercise of that power, so that you have people, if they go to ground and nominally identify as Christians, the way in which the power is being exercised, they could get away with things. In Guatemala, they could get away with still having day keepers, for instance. Or, I mean, in the African diaspora traditions, people could get away with having a practice under the guise of saints and so forth. Let's see. Yes, I'd like to recognize Ali Akai.
All right, I know that I've rambled a little too much, and I'm sorry for going on so long earlier.
No, I'm the one who's really rambling.
But the other thing, I think that what we're all kind of getting to, I think the conclusion that we're coming to is that one of the big points when we're talking about especially Catholicism and the way that it exercised sort of a soft power, and you see this in Hellenism and you see it with other indigenous traditions, with various indigenous polytheist traditions, and I'm using the term indigenous here meaning to, specific to a time and place, though obviously a lot of these traditions have expanded in revivalist areas to where there's Americans practicing Hellenism, there are heathens, etc. Like for revived traditions, it's significantly wider. I think that what we need to focus on as leaders within the polytheist community is sort of not necessarily emulating the authoritarian hierarchy of Catholicism, but emulating the sort of protection and acceptance that you see in churches for their individual members. And what I mean by that is that, for example, within Catholicism, when it was sort of an integrated part of the community, there was things like sanctuary. You could run in and claim that and, you know, get away from like whoever was pursuing you for however long you stayed within the church. There was this idea that these institutions sort of unite their communities. And in the modern day, most of our communities are, as the Mudong pointed out, as you pointed out, Butler, we're sort of diffuse. So we kind of have to create our own subcultures with our own subcultural societal support for one another, whether that's, you know, like my friends Ocean Keltaway and Wolf the Red, they have a Discord server in which they do different traditional like rituals for various holidays across a bunch of different pagan faiths. I've co-hosted a couple there, you know, back in the day. I'm actually working on building something similar specifically for Hellenism in my own server, holding these rituals where we all meet online and we're saying, you know, echo back prayers where people are making offerings on their individual altar can kind of mimic the polis festivals that we have lost in Hellenism as these societal things for people who don't like live in Greece or who don't live near any sort of organization. We can create these structures ourselves to help provide that extra support. We can build these communities both online and for some folks where there's higher concentrations of particular faiths in areas offline to try to create that support structure, because I think that that's what's missing. I think that's where a lot of the individual component is. Like, for example, when I realized that Dr. Stefanos was close to where I am, like physically, because I've mentioned that I live in Washington before, like that was mind-blowing because I've never met another Hellenist in person. Right? Like the majority of folks that I've interacted with live across the country or maybe even across the globe. I've got viewers that I talk with who live as far away as New Zealand and Australia and Britain, like completely across entire oceans. And the online space allows us to unite. And I think that, you know, our focus shouldn't be entirely online. I think that there is a value to in-person gatherings and practices and summits. But I think that we would be hard pressed to ignore the power that technology gives for us to create accepting communities. And I think that we need to really focus on that as leaders. I think that that is one of the essence of pluralism, is coming together as pagans and learning from each other and helping to grow, even, you know, not even necessarily for diaspora, for particular cultures, but the willingness to open ourselves so that our traditions can continue to anybody who is curious and has a heart which seeks the gods.
Yeah, absolutely. And as extreme minority traditions, obviously, the networking which the internet has made possible is absolutely crucial. Because it's the only way that you're going to get enough of us together in one place, metaphorically speaking, not in one physical place, but get enough of us together in a shared project with shared goals to actually amplify our power in the world, despite the small numbers, relatively speaking, that we may have, at least in explicitly declared adherents. All right, Thrax, a brief comment, and then I'm going to hand over to Hari Kiran for a closing statement.
So I'll be brief. Thank you, Edward, for facilitating and moderating this dialogue. Again, I do wish we just had hours of this. One of the things that I was remiss on in my earlier statements is the importance, the really central importance of the layperson. But I want to expand on that and talk about the various roles that are not the specialist or the technical specialist, and also the diversity of technical specialties that exist. One of the problems that comes with the as somebody in chat pointed out, one of the panelists here, the shadow of capitalism in all of this is that there is this demand for competition. There is this demand for this demand for this demand for. We could continue on and on about it. And one of the elements that I continue to see, again, across at least 2 dozen different distinct religious traditions, is that a lay person who comes in, who is truly called, who has true communion, they eventually feel, or my observation is that this is true of many, certainly not all, that the next step is then they need to become a specialist and become a professional. And the problem is that a lot of specialists and professionals who are genuinely that wind up in some manner, sometimes simply due to, at a mental health level, loneliness, encouraging that in others. And this discourages the sacred profundity of being a person who is in relationship devotionally, a person who is in relationship, period. And that's why some of my early published and presented works are around polytheisms as religions of relation, this dynamic of relationship. And I have actually forcibly and at cost to myself financially and otherwise stepped back from being a specialist in many areas in order to try and encourage more of that dynamic. Because I happen to also be educated in areas where I can help to cultivate that. And the problem is that that's not what my job as a specialist is. That is not what my gods chose me for. So I'm needing to, at times, mute my gods, which anybody who is a specialist knows is a horrendously bad idea, in order to try and help get people who aren't that, who aren't. And this isn't about gatekeeping, which is how most people hear this. Most people hear the idea of that as being inherently limiting. And it is not meant to be that. It is meant to be one of expansive celebration of. And when we have cultivated community dynamic, which encourages this idea of reaching for power, which is what so much drives so many people who are coming out of the deconversion dynamics and trauma dynamics that we're discussing. Reaching for power so that we don't feel powerless again. To accelerate ourselves up some form of perceived sequential hierarchy. But the entire dynamic of these traditions, and I can't speak for all traditions, but at least at a foundational level of pluralistic engagement and relational polycentric and animist dynamics, are there different roles? Yes, as panelists here have spoken from their specific traditions, there are some things that only a person who has undergone certain things can and should do. But that doesn't make them better than, or more powerful than, or more valuable than. And in many cases, it actually puts us as specialists in those positions in a position of being more dependent on dynamics that our 21st century global dynamic has corrupted to the point of extreme degradation. And it's harsh and it's hard. And I wish so much that so many people who they have so much heart and inspired calling toward devotion and that relational dynamic weren't still so hindered by the burden of this inherited, often intergenerational colonialist dynamic of that. And so I don't in any way want my earlier comments to sound like I'm pro-elitist model. The layperson is where the focus needs to be in order for the specialists to even exist still on the map.
Exactly. Well said. And I'm sure that everyone who was listening to your early remarks understood that was the import of them.